Hawkins spoke recently with Ben McNeil.
Ben, thanks for coming in. Congratulations on this book. It's a really, really interesting read.
Well, thanks, Georgia.
I want to talk to you because basically this argues the case for the expression we've heard over and over again. Now I think it's on the Prime Minister's website that the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. Plenty say it. I imagine you probably don't think that enough people believe it.
That's true. I think there's two things we have to think about in terms of climate change. There's one, which is a direct economic impact of climate change. That is for our agriculture, our ports from sea level rise, thermal temperatures changing the way we grow things, food prices, insurance premiums. These things are all economic hip pocket issues for Australians. Yeah. Then you've got the second issue. This is what the book touches on mostly, is that there's global trade shifts happening as we speak, as well as global economic opportunities in the new low-carbon economy of the future, which is going to address climate change on a global level. So there's two issues. Australia has to position itself as a leader to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in terms of reducing the exposure to the economy from climate change itself. And we need to position ourselves for a new global low-carbon, clean industrial revolution that's taking place as we speak. So therefore, there's actually two imperatives for us to shift and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and enter a new phase of a low-carbon economy in the future.
Ben, I reckon it's probably a pretty hard sell, and we've seen that at the moment, and even you concede in this book that while a low-carbon economy is a positive, that's in the long term. What about the mechanisms to get there, and especially in terms of an ETS? We've got businesses, lots of business groups saying they just cannot afford it. Yeah. Are you prepared to sit here and say they don't know what they're talking about?
No, so if in industry you have about 70% of industry are actually for a carbon price quite early because they know if we do it early, we have less to pay in the future. But then you do have, yes, as you're right, there's about 30% of industry who say, look, this is going to impose large costs. The government, by delaying the ETS by 1 year, in my mind, that's not a huge setback. I think there needs to be because we know the economy will recover. There's going to recover, but what we need is a meaningful carbon price to drive innovation, because if it doesn't drive innovation and we stick with no carbon price, then as the world is eventually, the US, the developed world in particular, are going to move towards low carbon, and we'll be left on our own saying, okay, our coal exports aren't worth anything anymore because we haven't developed the new technologies.
Trying to sell coal and there's no buyers.
Exactly.
Basically.
Essentially.
All right. One of the things I really like about your book is it's not just fact after fact. You give some really interesting case studies. Just explain to us, with regard to the auto industry, you talk about General Motors and the other US car makers versus the Japanese. Just explain to me what happened in the experiences with those companies.
Sure. So we always think about the economy versus the environment, and this is the perfect example of the car makers. The American car makers in the 1990s were always averse to the government imposing environmental regulations, fuel emission standards, fuel economy standards on their vehicles. Even though the Japanese, they were the complete opposite. They invested hugely into R&D and fuel-efficient vehicles because the government really put a value on that, essentially. And so what happened when the oil price in the early millennium, I guess the start of the new century, oil price started to really ramp up. Remember, before the GFC, huge oil ramp up in price. Now, the American car makers, because they didn't have those fuel economy standards, were developing these massive gas guzzlers. And now we see that Hummer, General Motors, is completely in turmoil. They've been losing billions, and Ford billions and billions before the GFC. The GFC was not the cause of this collapse. It was a catalyst, but it wasn't the actual cause of the collapse in the US car makers. It was because in the 1990s they said, no, we think it's going to be cheap oil always, and people are going to buy big gas guzzlers. And that was a really failed economic strategy. Toyota and Honda boosted their sales hugely. Toyota is now the largest car manufacturer in the world. And we can think about this example, the US versus the Japanese car makers, like where we're at now today. We are heavily dependent on coal. As the world starts to pay value carbon, and I'm not talking about time frames here, but as they do, coal is going to become very costly, and they're not they're not going to purchase our coal, essentially like the Hummer of the GM, those big four-wheel drives. So we need to be innovative. We need to put huge resources towards R&D in terms of developing new types of technologies that the world's going to crave. And to do that, it's both government and private.
So I'm guessing this is what you're meaning when you say that our biggest export is going to become our biggest liability.
Essentially, yeah. Yep. So it's the Hummer strategy. They had this. They were going great guns until the oil price went up, and people said, well, actually, not only is it really fuel inefficient, these vehicles, I don't want to purchase those, but also you've got an added carbon. A carbon price coming down the line, so people are shifting away. Yeah. And they're wanting more fuel-efficient vehicles. But even now, we know that oil is dwindling in terms of global production. Oil is a finite resource, aside from climate change. So we need to develop the new technologies for the future, which are going to grow new industries and new jobs for a green economy.
All right, let me ask you about that then, because the export reality is that coal is it for us.
Yeah, definitely.
I've interviewed Tim Flannery a couple of times. So I'm really interested in the fact that he used to be dead against it. He has now flipped around and said it's an imperative. We've got to work out clean coal technology.
Yeah, I agree.
Is that where you stand?
No, I've always been very, supportive of the technology. Now,
is it going to happen?
Understand.
Is it a reality? What's your view on that?
Well, it's not a silver bullet. This is what people think it's going to solve everything, and it's not, unfortunately, because there's two issues. That you've got the coal plants who are today running where they have been over the past 40 odd years. They may not have the reservoirs for that. With clean coal, this, I guess, step back one bit. Where there's a coal-fired power station, clean coal would trap the emissions, liquefy them and put them into underground reservoirs. But you need to have the plant near those underground reservoirs in the first place. So right now, unfortunately in Australia, many of the coal-fired power stations aren't near those reservoirs. So it's great for new coal-fired power stations, for example, because we can put them where those reservoirs are in close proximity. So I totally agree that we need to put huge resources in it, but I don't think that the industry, that is the coal industry, are putting enough resources into the R&D for this particular technology, despite it being an economic reality that the world's moving away from carbon. Yeah. So I think that's why a carbon price from a government is going to be so important, because it'll drive that investment.
All right, let me ask you about that then. Yep. Is legislation, when you talk about the fact this is an economic problem, not necessarily a moral one, how do you force the issue?
It's both.
It's both.
Yeah.
But I suppose what you've been saying is we really need to come to terms with the fact it is a major economic problem here. Yep. How do you force the issue? Is legislation, is an emissions trading scheme and a price on carbon the way to go?
It is, because it will drive what I call in the book accidental environmentalists. Now, what an accidental environmentalist is someone who could be a climate change skeptic, who could not care about the environment, but they're actually investing in clean technology and renewables
because
and other things, because there's a financial incentive, because they're going to make money. We have to get to the point to which there's profit to be made in cleaning up the world. If it doesn't, we're not going to solve this issue, and we're not going to grow the exports of the future for the new economy. So for governments, it's important for a carbon price, because if there's no carbon price, there's no incentive for these accidental environmentalists.